Welcome to the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in critical times. Here's your host, Bill Kelly.
This is the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in these critical times. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. And we are going through rough times here in Ontario and in Canada because of what's going on economically, which we've talked about numerous times on the podcast. But according to the data that we just received over the last couple of days, Canadians overwhelmingly still want to have Mark Carney as our Prime Minister to lead us through these choppy waters. Well, there's one exception to that we're going to get to in just a couple of seconds. What we're referring to here are a series of polls, national polls, that have come out in the last little while. Now, I know I've talked rather disparagingly about polls sometimes in the past here, especially around election time, because I don't necessarily know that they give us an accurate picture. I think people tend to play loose and fast sometimes with the answers they give some of the pollsters. But non-election time, which is where we are right now, they can be a pretty good indicator as to where people's minds are, and especially now because, let's face it, economically, there's some concerns here with what's happening with the job market and the price of groceries and mortgage rates and affordability for houses. We've talked about those issues. Well, who's best to lead us? I want to talk kind of in reverse order because there's three major polls that came out this week. The Angus Reid poll, the Nanos poll, and one from Abacus Research. And I want to talk about that one first briefly because it was one thing that just kind of raised everybody's eyebrows. According to this Abacus poll, they say the Conservatives now lead the Liberals in popular support. Now, if there was an election today, would you vote for? And they say the Conservatives have a 1-point lead. Now, I have seen no data anywhere other than this poll anywhere in the country, nor the people I've talked to, nor the political pundits that I've talked to, nor the other podcasters that I've talked to that seem to think that the Conservatives have actually pulled ahead. I don't know where Abacus gets this data. I don't know if they just did their survey in the newsroom of the National Post, where a lot of the Conservative support seems to be. It just seems to be an anomaly, but it is what it is. Now, I know that historically, the Abacus data and the polls that they've done in the past do tend to lean conservative to the right a little more than a lot of the other pollsters. And so I don't know where they get their data. I don't know who they're actually polling, who they're talking to in situations like this, but it's there and it's published, and that's what they're saying, that Pierre Poilievre has actually closed the gap between he and Mark Carney. And if you would just simply read that poll, and some people will do that. It was in the National Post. So if you're a reader of that paper and you're seeing that data, you're going to say, aha, see, our guy's coming back. Poilievre is going to make this huge resurgent. Well, let me focus on the other two polls that came out too, who have been around for a long time. The Nanos poll, which, by the way, is somewhat different from the other poll that we just talked about. The Nanos poll now says that the Liberals had a 43.7% popularity support. The Conservatives are at 34.2%. That's not close. The Liberals still with a huge, huge lead. And when you look at the preference for party leader, once again, Mark Carney has a huge, huge lead. Preferred Prime Minister, 52.2% of Canadians prefer Mark Carney as our Prime Minister. 26% like Pierre Poilievre. That's hardly close. Well, look what the Abacus polls seem to indicate. And that's Nanos. The other one that I want to talk about here is, again, people that we've talked to many, many years on our radio show. And that, of course, is the folks at Angus Reid. They've been around for a long, long time. And they have done their polling as well. And, there's a story here that I find fascinating. Because I know there are some people that are saying, look, things aren't moving as quickly as we wanted. We don't have the trade deal with the states yet. Is there some reservation now about the choices that we made in the last election? Not really. About 2 out of 3 people think the Conservatives should replace Pierre Poilievre. That's according to this Angus Reid poll. Get rid of the guy. That's all there is to it. About a third of the Conservative voters approve of how Mark Carney is running the government. When 31% of the guys on the other team say, yeah, the Liberal guy is better than our guy, that tells you something too. That's a rather telling statistic. Same idea we had, the discussion we had before the election that said, well, young voters are really leaning conservative here, and they kind of like Pierre Poilievre, and he has a significant lead. Well, that manifested itself, I guess, maybe in a few seats, especially in Southern Ontario here. But the polling today seems to indicate that even those younger voters now prefer Mark Carney. In other words, they've seen him in action. They like what he's doing. It's interesting because, in desperate times, I don't know if we're desperate yet, but we're in challenging times, shall we say, because of what's happening economically. You want somebody who's really got their head screwed on properly. And clearly the Canadians are saying, not Poilievre, but let's stick with Mark Carney. Carney has a 29-point advantage for being calm and rational, 27-point lead over Poilievre for being a kinder person, well, which matters, a 25% lead for being more deep and useful and experienced than Poilievre, and 24% lead for being more thoughtful and strategic. That sounds like a pretty ominous lead, but I think it indicates where Canadians' heads are at these days. We know that things are rough. We know that they're not going smoothly. We know that there's still an awful lot of questions that need to be asked. But overwhelmingly, according to the Nanos poll and the Angus Reid poll, Canadians seem to feel that, look, we got the right guy in charge. It's not maybe working out quickly as we wanted, and we're not necessarily getting the results yet that we really want to see when it comes to negotiations and trade, but they seem very confident in Carney. And that tells us an awful lot, because obviously in the past, when we've had situations that have been challenging like this, there's been a real question about leadership and whether or not we're going in the right direction. The previous Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, I think is a great example of that. Canadians just didn't seem to have a whole lot of faith in him as a leader. And it's quite the opposite with Mark Carney. And I think that tells a lot about exactly where Canadians' heads are these days, because we're not exactly where we want to be right now. The tariff situation, the trade stuff, the trade negotiations that are going on right now between Canada and the United States can be frustrating. We've talked about, we may have a deal. No, instead they've raised tariffs on this and that and the other thing. But, we're still saying, well, look, this is the team that we want, because I think most Canadians, and we've heard a lot of feedback from you on some of the podcasts we've done previously, and I say clearly what the pollsters are finding out too, is that, we're not where we want to be, but the problem is south of the border. It's not here. They have great faith, clearly, in Mark Carney and his team to try to get Canada's economy rolling and get us on the right track, especially with trade with the United States. But I think most Canadians understand that the problem is Donald Trump, which is something I find interesting, because one of the things, just to harken back to the Abacus poll that we referenced, that has the Conservatives slightly ahead, I still shake my head when I see that, is that they say that, the Donald Trump influence is really faded and the economy is the much more important issue. And I see that. I get that, okay? The price of groceries, housing affordability, and things like that. But here's the rub. I don't disagree with that, but you've got to connect the dots here. And when we talk about rising prices and the cost of groceries, the cost of building a home, for instance, it's tied to Donald Trump. Not exclusively. I understand that. There are some global problems that are going on. But, when you look at tariffs on things like lumber and steel and aluminum and the things that are going on economically and the strings that the United States are pulling right now, that's having an adverse effect on prices on this side of the border. We know that. So, when we see the dilemma here and we understand, look at, our guys are doing the best that they can, and they're trying to come back with some sort of a deal here. But, as we've talked about on previous podcasts, if the guys on the other side of the table don't want a deal, our hands are tied. There's not a whole lot we can do here. So, you have to stay the course. We have to do something differently. And I know that, some of the people on the right, some of the critics of the government have been quite vocal about this and saying, well, Carney is capitulating. No, he's not. As we've talked about, removing the counter tariffs on some of the items, especially ones that had previously been covered by the Kuzma trade deal, was the right strategy. Because the United States simply said, we're not even going to talk to you until you do something about that. I mean, they were pissed. Donald Trump was pissed. They were all pissed what Canada did with retaliatory tariffs. And keep in mind, there are only two countries in the world that decided to apply those sorts of retaliatory tariffs. One was China, and one was us, Canada. Well, the United States can be angry as hell at China if they want, but they don't dare poke the bear, because that is one of the largest, if not the largest economy in the world these days. And they understand that they just can't start a trade conflict with China. They can nitpick and do their own little thing from time to time, but Canada is easy prey. And we've seen that happen, especially from the results, not just what Trump is saying, but what some of the other people on his team are saying, that they're really angry about the counter tariffs. So until we get those off the table, they're simply not going to agree to talk and to negotiate in any way, shape, or form. Well, that's happened now. So we're all waiting with great anticipation to see, now what's the U.S. going to bring to the table? Is there going to be a reduction in tariffs? I think we have to be realistic here that the chances of actually eliminating those tariffs are probably slim and none. But if there's a reduction, if there's a way that we can look at try to mitigate some of the impact, well, that can be a win for Canada. And don't forget, as we talked about a couple of podcasts ago, the other thing that we need to keep on the radar, at least our government has to keep on the radar, is that there is going to be a renegotiation of the CUMSA deal, the Canada-U.S. deal, in the next few months. And we don't want these guys in a foul mood when they sit down at the table for that. Because, again, our economy is very much dependent upon having a relationship with the United States. Now, what's happening in the meantime, while we're doing those negotiations, while Dominic LeBlanc is down there, is Mark Carney is over in Europe this week and cutting deals with other countries, which is a very positive step in the right direction about diversifying the economy, which I think kind of circles all the way back to the way we started this with the polling to suggest that our guy's doing the right thing. I know he talked about big moves, big, bold moves. Well, he's done that too. The infrastructure bill that they passed just before they went on their summer break is key. Now Carney is talking about what we mentioned months ago about opening up the Churchill port on Hudson Bay as a shipping route to try to get things like liquid natural gas and other products to the European market. That's a good move. The other guy, Trudeau, didn't want to do that, remember? He just simply dismissed it out of hand. So there's a change in attitude with this prime minister, and it's already starting to pay benefits. It's not going to happen in 48 hours. It's, we got to get the port going. We got to get the stuff going back and forth before we start to see the results of that. But Canadians clearly, according to these polls, believe in the guy who's calling the shots in Ottawa now, and they certainly didn't previously. As for Poilievre as an alternative, well, his numbers have continued to slide. And that's reflected, I think, in people's attitude toward him and the fact that over 60% of the people think that the Conservative Party simply has to get rid of Pierre Poilievre. They just don't look at him as an alternative here. The Liberals, on the other hand, are simply saying, look, he's going to go back into Parliament in just a couple of weeks. He's probably going to be the same old Poilievre, and the Liberals are happy about that. They say, yeah, keep being Poilievre, because the polling indicates that Canadians like you less and less and less the more Poilievre you are. So that's good for the Liberals, and I suppose as long as he stays on those opposition sides, it's probably good for Canada too, and that's what we're looking for here. Interesting always to see that reflected in some of these polls, and we'll keep tracking that for you in the weeks and months ahead. That's it for this edition of the podcast. Thank you so much for being with us. Wherever you get your podcast, whichever platform, we thank you. And we've had so many new people come on side in the last little while, and it's great to have that dialogue going back and forth so we can share some of our ideas. By the way, if you're on YouTube, don't forget to hit that notification bell and check the podcast description as well. We always put some background material on these podcasts to give you some context to add to the discussion. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button. So many of you have done that in the last couple of weeks especially, and thank you so much for that. The loyalty to the podcast is really heartening, but we want to continue the work here, and by subscribing, you can help us to continue the work over the weeks and months ahead as we head through these very challenging times here in Canada. Thanks, as always, to Madeline Kelly for the great work putting this one together. Until next time, I'm Bill Kelly. Stay in touch and stay informed.
Bill Kelly Podcast brought to you by Wizen's Law, personal injury lawyers. Listen, you didn't choose to get injured, but you can choose the right lawyer. Wizen's Law, 905-522-1102 or wizenslaw.com.